Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So, what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1 hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. Let me briefly explain, what do we understand by neoliberalism or neoliberal globalization? And basically, neoliberalism, literally or metaphorically, what it means is when the conservative economists pull out certain things from the liberal economists of 19th century or early 20th century, like people like Adam Smith and others. And the assumptions in neoliberal economics are that markets are the main regulators of capitalism. Government should not intervene much, right? And we should let the market decide what rises and what falls. And that if the rich could keep more of their money, hence reduce their taxes, they'll go and produce jobs. And when they'll create jobs, wealth from them will trickle down. These are some of the assumptions. The philosophical assumptions about human nature are that we all are by our nature self-maximizers, that we want to do better, right? So if we create an environment where there is less government regulation, each one of us will go and seek our own personal self-interest. And in the process, we'll create a society of people who are self-maximizers, and everything will rise up. The problem with that argument, of course, is that we are assuming a universal self-interest, that everyone's self-interest is the same. But even if you go read Adam Smith and his chapter on labor, you will realize that no, the self-interest of the capitalists and workers are completely opposed to each other. The capitalist wants to extract more labor for less money. The worker wants to give less labor for more money, right? So if we assume a universal self-interest, we are probably assuming the self-interest of the dominant class, right? So these are some of the things to keep in mind. Now, you might have also encountered the term the global village and global culture. All of these terms serve a purpose, right? Because they serve the purpose of the dominant. If you just assume that the world has become one because of Facebook and YouTube and all that, whose interest does it serve? Right? Because if you assume that the status quo is the real, then whosoever is in the dominant position have made you part of their project because you have stopped questioning the system. So anytime you see the term global village or this big tent world and all, do keep in mind that these are loaded terms and they have a politics. And the politics is to offer the world in which we live as natural, right? And the order in which it exists also as natural. And our job as humanities scholars is, of course, to question that. So, how do we take some of these insights and some of these knowledges and use it in our classes, but also in our writing? And this is a question that perplexes a lot of people. So, knowledge of globalization and economics is just like any other knowledge, just like reading your Marx, reading your Foucault. You can approach it from any different position. The only thing that to keep in mind is that you have to explain your terms, right? So, I have a whole webinar on how to write a research paper. If you just follow that pattern, that you start with what you are trying to say, IMF is an oppressive institution, whatever. I mean, that wouldn't be a good thesis. And then, since we deal with literature and humanities, we are reading stories, we are reading poems, we are reading novels. that create a world of their own, that represent something to the readers, right? So it could be a question of representation. You could pick up a novel, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. Is it satirical? Is it ironic? If it is satirical, what is it satirizing, right? And what it is satirizing is this idea that anyone who's innovative enough can make a lot of money in today's capitalism, right? But if it is an earnest representation of the world, just like you asked in Marxism, whose worldview is represented as normal, right? If the poor are failing in this, what are the causes of that? Are they attributed to the individual person, or are there instances of structural inequalities that are making someone's lives better? So, what is the novel or the short story normalizing? What is it steeped in, right? And that's where your knowledge of globalization and how the global economy works will come in handy, because the novelists are writing in the today's world. And the questions to pose would then be, are they challenging the way the world works, or are they normalizing that and want us to work within that, whatever limited role we might have in it? That's one way of using this knowledge in a paper or in a thesis. And so these are some of my thoughts. Now, the perplexing question a lot of people have is, how to use this theoretical knowledge to write a paper or to write a thesis. And so my formula is that you start with what you want to say about anything. I will write about Rohinton Mistri's A Fine Balance, right? What do I want to write about it? That the novel is a great example of the precarity that is produced in neoliberal capital in the far-flung parts of the world, in this case in India. And then you give your explanation, your understanding of how the global economy works, right? So you will give a few passages of your own understanding. You will cite people who have explained it, right? Since you have used the term precarity, then you might also want to go and see who has theorized it. What does it mean, right? And then within the novel, you will go and analyze what are the global or local imperatives of economy, of politics, that make the lives of these three characters precarious, right? And that's the first step. Beyond that, then we also discuss, what do we learn from it? What do we take from that novel as we discuss it? Does it mobilize us to think more critically of the kind of world in which we exist? Can we come up with some modes of challenging it, some modes of thinking differently about it? So these are like just my off the cuff ideas. I actually wrote an article on Rohinton Mistri's novel, and it should be coming out probably this year. Now, another question that came to me was from Jamaica. Someone was writing a thesis about the impact of IMF policies on Jamaican culture and its representations in fiction and in, Jamaican writing. And that also, you can apply the same rules to it. If you're going to talk about IMF policies, give your reader an understanding of what do you understand IMF to be, right? Read up on it. Now, we all know that IMF is one of the three Bretton Woods institutions. What were the Bretton Woods? You don't have to explain it in your paper, but you need to know it, right? So the Bretton Woods institutions were the three institutions created by the victorious Second World War powers. They met in this small town in Vermont called Bretton Woods and decided that they need to build a mechanism so that the world economy remains stable. So the World Bank was one of those. International Monetary Fund was the second of those. And the third one was then called General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it's now called the World Trade Organization. Now, out of these, IMF deals with short-term loans, right? This is the institution you go to if your economy has a cash shortfall and you need to fill that gap, so you borrow money from IMF. IMF has its shareholders. Those are the most powerful nations in the world. So when you borrow money from IMF, then you have to agree to their terms. Part of the agreement is that you will not spend this money on non-developmental expenditure or on long-term planning of your economy, because the loan is meant to fill the shortfall. And so because of that, education, healthcare, and everything else becomes, non-developmental expenditure. Now, once you owe money to IMF, then the agreement that you have made also forces you to create policies that secure that loan, right? So IMF then has the power to come to you and say, you need to increase your taxes, you need to not spend too much money on this, you need to not spend too much money on that. So their role becomes more and more intrusive. And so most developing nations since 1973 are trapped in this IMF debt trap, right? They can't even pay back those debts. They are just servicing those debt. Every budget year, the first line in their budget is to pay the interest on the IMF loan. On the other hand, IMF has the power to restructure your economy. How can they coerce you to do that? Well, if you fail, if you don't pay your interest on time, or if you don't implement the policies, no one will trade with you. You will become a pariah nation and your economy would tumble because the economy is still global. Now, how does IMF then safeguard the interest of the powerful nations? That is because the voting system in IMF is what is called, it's weighted, right? So every country has a vote, but the value of your vote is connected to your GDP. So United States, I mean, I'm just using hypothetical examples. Every time United States votes, it's not counted as one vote. It's probably counted as 80 votes, right? So that means the developing nations do not even have the power, even if they have the numbers, to change IMF policy or its functioning, because they do not have enough weighted votes to change anything. So this is some of the knowledge that you have to bring to bear in your understanding of IMF, right? Then if you're writing about Jamaica, then you go to give us a little bit of history. When did Jamaica get entrapped into this IMF debt trap? So you bring that knowledge, and then you say, okay, this is when Jamaica got caught into that trap. And then since you're a literature scholar, you're going to then go and see what kind of representations are there of that. What kind of life is really being represented in a novel or in a short story. And then you can connect that life not to just the individual acts of failure, but to the policies that predetermine in so many ways what your lot will be in life. So that would be one way of using that knowledge. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.